Hello and welcome to another episode of the Upgrade Your Education Business podcast. I'm Samantha, and today's an interesting one because today I want to talk about how you can make your content work really hard for you. You know, you're spending the time, you might be spending the money in investing in getting really good content produced, but unless it works hard, that time isn't being used as effectively as it could. Now, during this episode, here's what's going to happen for just some of you. Some of you are going to be tempted to switch off because you'll want me to tell you just what to do and you'll want to take action. You just want to get on with it. And I'm not telling you off for it. I get it. Time is tight and you don't want to necessarily spend ages with the thinking part because it feels like you're wasting time. You just want to take that action. But here's the thing, and I know this because whenever I deliver at conferences, for example, whenever I do an in-person talk, I always find there are two groups of people. And the group of people who kind of disengage a little bit because they want actions are usually stuck in the loop of thinking that more equals more all the time. So if they just produce more content, they'll naturally get results. And I'm going to explain in a minute why that actually isn't true, but with a really good analogy that I love from a business coach. But here's the second group of people, and I really hope you fall into this one. You want to get results. And whenever I meet this group of people, they understand that if you're going to do something and for that something to actually work, it's going to take some thinking about. Thinking and planning is what makes content work really hard for you, not just doing and implementing. If you do without the thinking, then you might risk your content not working quite as hard as it could. And the thing that made me want to deep dive into this was actually based on a short video that I came across from a business coach called Taki. I came across him on Instagram, but I think his main channel is YouTube. Check him out, he's really good. And he's got some really great content. And in this one clip, he said how when we put content out there, we're essentially putting it into a container. So think of that container as a social media platform or a blog or YouTube or someone's inbox. Either way, when we're putting something into a container, that container already has quite a lot of that thing. In fact, when we think about the world of content, the containers are very full. We could actually say they're overspilling. So logically, it doesn't make sense to say, okay, well, the solution is just to add more to it. And fundamentally, this forces us to think about what we're putting out there because once you know that analogy, you can't unknow it. And you're not going to want to just add to that overspilling container. So, what do you do? Well, whenever I talk about making your content work hard for you, I talk about the need to achieve two things. The first thing we want to achieve is for our content to start a conversation. And that could be a real one or a metaphorical one. I'll explain in a minute. And the second thing is to create the kind of content that makes people think. Now, this is the reason we need to do this if we want our content to work hard. One of the reasons is because relationships and connections make more sales than a beautiful image that we've created in Canva. A beautiful image or an attention grabbing video will stop the scroll. It might make someone pause while they're reading through your email, your social media post, your blog. So great, you've got their attention, but you only have their attention for a few seconds before they move on and forget about what they've just seen. So your content has only worked for a few seconds. And the only thing you will have achieved in that situation is stopping someone for a few seconds. Now, I'm going to assume that's not the reason you produce content. I'm going to assume that ultimately you're putting content out there because you want to make sales, you want to build your audience, you want people to get to know you. You want people to really understand your values and you want to position yourself as a go to in your niche. So, if we want all of that to happen, we need to do more than stop people for a few seconds. And this is where creating conversations or starting conversations and making people think actually transforms the results you get from the content you put out there. Before I talk about the how, I promised that I would explain what I meant by those things. So let's start with the conversation part. If I put a piece of content out there, let's just say one piece, and that moves someone to send me a message or to book a call with me, I've just started a conversation. And what that means is that I may well have stopped that person in their tracks for a few seconds with that piece of content, but the effect of it has lasted for much longer. It has moved someone to independently take action because they want to know more. When I talk about metaphorical conversations, it might be that that piece of content has created so much curiosity for the person consuming it that they actually want to know a little bit more about you, about what you offer and how you offer it. So maybe they go down a rabbit hole of listening to your podcast or watching your YouTube channel or checking out more of your content on whichever platform we're talking about. Maybe they're so curious about you and what you offer that they go to your website and they start exploring, and then they start going a bit deeper and they book a call with you, and then they maybe buy from you. So you can see that whether you're starting a real conversation or a metaphorical one, the reason why that's so important is because both of them take people beyond that one piece of content. But it only took that one piece of content to move them to take action. Or maybe it took a series of really valuable content to move them to be in a position to take that action. Either way, it came through intentional and well thought through content, not just the type that's designed to grab people's attention or to get loads of engagement. It's the type of content that inspires people to do something, to take some further action. Now, the second thing I mentioned that's important is to make people think. Let's imagine that I only shared a really small and well curated clip from this podcast episode into one of my content channels. And let's imagine that tiny little clip got someone thinking, and that thought led them to grab their notepad or open the notes app on their phone. And then they created this chain reaction where they've got these thoughts and their ideas just because I triggered something. They're now going to associate me with someone who inspires them and motivates them and plants great ideas in their minds. So, once again, that one piece of content has worked incredibly hard for me because its effects lasted longer than a few seconds. It means that naturally I'll be more memorable for that person. I mean, I'm terrible at remembering names. When I was a teacher, I physically had to have the class list in my hand with pictures from the register so that I could call students by the right name, even though I saw them multiple times a week. I'm terrible for names. And without any digging around, I didn't even have to look at my phone when I was scripting out this episode. I remembered the name of that business coach who I referred to at the beginning because he made me think. He quite literally, with a tiny piece of content, made me pull out my notes app on my phone because I couldn't type at the time. I was speaking into my phone while it typed for me, and I scripted out this entire podcast episode. So I'm not going to forget him in a hurry. And he has just earned himself a new fan. I actually don't know very much about him because I really did come across a 30-second clip and I really did pull out my notes app. So I went and checked him out afterwards. And, he's got all this great content and great advice out there. So that is an example of content working really hard in action. As a consumer of that kind of content, I know the impact it had on me and how he's now very memorable to me. So to be able to create the kind of content that starts conversations and makes people think and therefore connects with them, we have to start with actually understanding our audience. Now, you could do a theoretical exercise of mapping out a client's avatar, but what's more powerful than that is to base it on real people who you've spoken to, or maybe on people you've worked with, or people who you currently work with. And if you're not in that position, you can join things like forums and Facebook groups and invite people to as many free calls as possible so that you're really learning about them. I've been running my tuition business for 8.5 years right now, and I've been running Upgrade Your Education business for 6 years. I still take as many free discovery calls as possible. At the beginning of my journey, I would speak to everybody who came my way. And as I got to know my audience, as I got busier, I had to be a little bit more boundaried around my time. So I put some gatekeepers in place so that I was only speaking to people who I needed to speak to. But nonetheless, I still continue speaking to people. There are coaches who will tell you to scrap discovery calls. They themselves don't do calls anymore. You have to fill in things like application forms. And I'm not saying they're wrong, because maybe that's what works for them. Maybe they have other ways to really get to know their audience. I don't know. But what I do know is that because of all of those calls, I know my niche really well. I know my target audience really well. In fact, whenever I'm creating training, whenever I'm creating a podcast episode, I have real people in my mind and I pretend I'm speaking to them. So, what that means is that I can predict what kind of things my audience are interested in. So, for example, if the title of this podcast episode had the words social media marketing or group classes in it, it would outperform all the rest of my episodes. It always does. Without fail, whenever I talk about those topics, whether it's in a webinar, whatever, it flies off the shelf. The reason I don't constantly talk about those two things is because there is more to our success and more things we need to learn than those two things. And I'm always going to prioritize that over chasing likes and listeners or whatever. But that gives me something really valuable about my audience. It gives me some really valuable information. The reason I know that those episodes do well is partly because I look at data. But before I had that data, I already knew they'd be popular because they are the things that most people ask me in discovery calls. So when I was thinking about what kind of course I wanted to create, creating one to show people how to set up their group classes and make sales, which by the way is having a really exciting revamp. If you bought my launch, teach and fill group classes course or thought about buying it, I've got some really exciting stuff for you coming up. And by the way, if you've already bought it, you'll get any updates. You won't have to pay any more. Anyway, I digress. When I was thinking about creating a course, it was a no brainer. I knew instantly what I needed to create a course about. It was either going to have to be about groups or social media. And when I was thinking of running a webinar, I knew exactly what I needed to talk about. And both of them have been really well attended, the two I've done so far this year. And it's not because I'm really good with my Canva skills or because I can produce 100 pieces of content in an hour. It's not because I sat in a done for you session or because I said, let's write content together session. It's because I learned about my audience. That's what made my content work really hard for me. So if you want to start those conversations, if you want to make people think, you have to get to know them first. You need to know who they are, what their perceptions are, what their pain points are, and a lot more. You have to know them really, really well. Now, when it comes to starting those conversations, you also have to use your audience and what you know about your niche as your guide. And, you have to try things out and use your experience. Something that's really important to remember, and I talked about this recently at a conference, is that people's perception is their reality. So let's imagine, and I'm going to use the whole group class thing as an example. Let's imagine that on the whole, people believe that one to one support when it comes to any learning situation will always be more effective than a group situation. Now, I know this isn't true. You probably know this isn't true because there's no one size fits all, and you get different things from different environments. In fact, it's why in my bespoke one to one accelerator program, I don't just have one to ones, I also have group support because both of them have value. But if you're sat there thinking, but I want to work one to one with Sam, it has to be purely one to one. There's very little point in me producing content for you that pushes the advantages of the group coaching element. That's not going to make you think, and it's not going to make you get curious, and it's not going to start a conversation with you. But if I meet you where you're at, then I might produce the kind of content that firstly talks about the one to one support, because I know that will give you reassurance and safety. And then I might very gently bring in the group element. And instead of talking about all the advantages, I might show you interesting snippets from some course that we've had that piques your curiosity. Now, that's just a hypothetical because I know that many people do believe that one to one is the holy grail in any learning situation. But the people who I attract and the people who I work with don't think that. And therefore, I don't generally have to take that approach. But you might be in that situation, or you can apply this to different perceptions about different things. The thing to remember is that instead of working against someone's perception, you want to meet their perception. So, what most of us do when we get started with content, and I sometimes help people just get started like this too, because if you're at the beginning stages, you just need something that starts the process and then you get strategic. But what most of us do is we put together a bit of a schedule and we decide what kind of content we'll post. So, we might post some value one day, we might post a testimonial on another, we might post something inspirational on another day, we might post something about ourselves on another day, and we just kind of work with this plan. But if you have gained momentum with something like that, if you now feel confident about putting content out there, it's time for you to upgrade that strategy. It's time for you to stop putting something out there just so you can say you've published some content on that day, and to put content out there that's going to work really hard for you, even if it means reducing how much you're putting out there, because you're actually taking more time to plan and to think. More doesn't always equal to more. Remember that container. If we're not connecting with people to start a conversation, to make them think, we're just adding to that already full container. We're adding to the overspilling container of content. So, a really good way to approach this is to start looking over your notes from calls that you may have had with clients, or to start thinking of very specific conversations or challenges or perceptions that you have learnt from your target audience. And at first, you're just going to have this messy set of notes, and that's fine because you're gathering really valuable information. Maybe your first step needs to be to start thinking about how you can produce the kind of content that encourages people to book a call with you so that you can gather that kind of information. Maybe you've realized that you haven't been speaking to enough people. So at this stage, just do what you need to do to start gathering that valuable information, because everything else will rest on that. That is the big thing that will have the knock on effect on everything else so that your content can work really effectively. So get to know your audience. Now, when you've got this great information, if you can categorize it, try and organize it in some kind of semblance. If you can't, don't worry about it. But if you can categorize it, you might have something like something that fits with specific offers that you have, or you might have a category for hesitations and perceptions that people have, another category for what you know people really like to hear about, hot topics. So categories can form quite naturally from all of this information. You don't need to get hung up on them. And those categories will become your content pillars. If you're struggling to categorize, that's fine, because I promise you it'll happen organically as you go through your notes and as you realize that there are some trends. And you can just start the process by referring to your notes before producing any piece of content. So now what you're doing is your content is connecting with people, and you know it will, because they've already given you the information. You are literally repeating their words back to them. Now, when you're producing that kind of content, you're asking yourself two questions. Have I started a conversation, and have I made people think? Your content doesn't have to tick both of those boxes every single time. But if you want it to work hard, it should tick one of those boxes. And the thing that answers both of those questions, the thing they both have in common, is you want to see how you can evoke curiosity. That's what starts a conversation. That's what makes people think. So you don't need to tell people everything there is to know about a specific topic you're talking about, or this one thing about yourself, or this one thing about what you offer. You don't need to cram it with all that information. You don't need to tell people everything, because then you block the conversation. You haven't given them a reason to ask more questions, to do a bit of digging, to book a call with you, to think about it a little bit more. You've given them everything. But you also don't want to tell them so little that the content doesn't have substance, or they feel a bit frustrated, where you've said, I'm going to tell you about X, Y, and Z, but you haven't actually delivered. So you have to experiment with this, and you have to find a little bit of a balance. Either way, Whether you kind of learn this by doing or whether you feel like you need to plan this out, you just have to practice. That part is something that I can't accelerate for you. You have to keep doing it and exercising that muscle and just pay attention to the kind of engagement, the kind of response, the kind of results you're getting and tweak as you go along. Treat it always as an experiment because in the world of digital content, things change all the time anyway. And when you're thinking of results, be very clear about what you're looking out for because results don't always come or need to come in the form of direct sales. They might do, but they might result in the number of discovery calls you're booking. Maybe that's your goal. One reason why I still continue my podcast, and this really is just one of the reasons, not the only one, is that the majority of people who book calls with me or start working with me tell me they've come through my podcast. And so if I think of this podcast purely as a business tool, it's really serving its purpose. Honestly, I keep doing this podcast because when I left the classroom, I got so much out of Facebook groups and communities. So when I set up Upgrade Your Education business, I always promised myself that I would have something where I just give back to that community, where I pay it forward. So the fact that I do get discovery calls booked in through the podcast and I do get clients from people listening to this makes it worthwhile. It makes it quite strategic and intentional. And I use the data to tell me what kind of topics I should talk about or what people like to know about. I use my knowledge from all the conversations that I have with people, the work I do with people, to steer what I talk about as well. And people sometimes suggest topics to me, so they make requests. And so if I'm hearing directly from people, then of course it makes sense to create content about it. So, this podcast and my content is driven very much by my audience. It's not really driven by me. So, I hope this episode has made you think because that thinking time is so valuable if you're ready to get more strategic and if you're ready to do less to get more, because producing more content, adding more platforms to your marketing suite won't necessarily get you better results. It will just make you busier. So, thanks as always for giving me your time, and you'll hear from me on Wednesday.